In my last lecture, I talked about culture and how it shapes our collective values and social norms. In this lecture, I want to look at how those norms and values are actually taught to us. This is a process that we call socialization. Kathleen Corrigan and Jonathan Wright entitled Chapter 5, which is the topic of this lecture, Learning How to Act in Society. And I think that's a really good way of thinking about socialization. It's a process by which we learn how to act in society. Corrigan and White introduce us to the concept of the looking glass self. This is a concept that was first put forth by the symbolic interactionist Charles Horton Cooley in 1902. Cooley basically argued that we define ourselves in relation to others. Specifically, we develop a self-image that's based on how we think others see us. Corrigan and White summarize this as follows. I am what I think you think I am. A vivid illustration of this is the Frontline episode Merchants of Cool, which I asked you to watch for this unit. Toward the end of this excerpt, we are introduced to a 13-year-old girl by the name of Barbara. Barbara's the blonde who is participating in the model search. Barbara states, I need to look good for people. Now note that she doesn't say, I need to look good. She says, I need to look good for people, suggesting that she's defined not so much by her appearance as she is by how others view her and perceive her. Now, one of the final images that we see of Barbara is of her dancing with this young man at this party. And what's striking is not so much that she's dirty dancing with this guy, although that's rather disturbing in and of itself, given that she's 13 years old, but that she's trying to give the cameraman and us, the viewer, what she thinks that we want, which is a young, sexualized girl. It's clearly debatable whether we want that or not, but she is acting in a way that she thinks is according to what we want her to be, which is a beautiful illustration of the looking glass self, even if it's rather sad in her case. What's critical to sociologists then is how we define ourselves in relation to others. George Herbert Mead in 1913 called this the generalized other, which is basically a fancy way of saying society. The generalized other is society, and we define ourselves in relation to it, or through our social interaction with others. In the words of Corrigan and White, no self can develop without social interaction. It's through that social interaction that we come to define ourselves and articulate a particular self-concept. So this is how we develop in relation to others, but how does that process actually come about? Sociologists contend that there are various groups of people that teach us about society's values and norms. And we call these socializing agents. These are basically society's teachers, and they include our family, our peers, our teachers, our religious leaders, and of course our media outlets. The family is probably the most important socializing agent to us in our infancy and early childhood. But as soon as our worlds widen to include others from outside the family unit, the peer group becomes increasingly important. And our peer group is basically those we associate with, those who are like ourselves. The perfect peer moment would be high school, in which we try to act in ways that are deemed acceptable or cool by our peers. Maybe this means skipping school, maybe it means getting good grades, maybe it means wearing certain clothes. Whatever the case, our peers shape what we come to value and how we come to act in our social world. One of the most studied socializing agents is the media, and the media is basically any medium that transmits information. It could be a newspaper, film, television, the internet, books. The media has a huge impact on how we see ourselves. So for example, in the article you read by Melissa Milkey, You learned about studies showing that the self-esteem of young girls can be affected by unrealistic beauty images that they see in the media around them. Now, one of the major points made by Milky and others is that we don't just absorb these cultural messages passively. We take them, we evaluate them, we assess them for how appropriate they are for our lives. So many scholars, for example, argue that some young girls are able to evaluate the beauty images they see in the media as being very unrealistic, and therefore in a way protect themselves from these images and protect their self-esteem from these images. To study whether this happens or how this happens, Melissa Milky interviews 9th and 10th graders at a couple high schools in the Midwest. And she was interviewing them about their perceptions of girls' magazines and the images that they found in them. She found that on the whole, girls were very critical of these images. They found them unrealistic, they found them almost unattainable, and yet most of the girls, the white girls in particular, felt beholden to them. They felt like they were still accountable to them, however unrealistic they were. Why? Well, according to Milky, the girls that she interviewed thought that these images were accepted and important to others. In other words, although the girls themselves found them unrealistic, they felt like others found them realistic and expected them to live up to them. Another really good illustration of the power of the media and our peer groups is Merchants of Cool, which again is the Frontline episode that I had you watch. As the show points out, media is big business, and there's a lot of money to be made going after the youth market. Viacom-owned MTV earned $1 billion in profits in just 1 year, and they've really turned, MTV is known as really turning market research into an art form. From these studies, MTV and other Viacom programs have developed 2 prototypes. The MOOC, which is a loud, obnoxious, crude character that is epitomized by Howard Stern, that is meant to reach male audiences, and what they call the midriff, which is the uber-sexualized yet innocent young girl who is empowered through her sexuality, epitomized by Britney Spears, and is meant to reach the female market. Now, it's important to note that Viacom and others don't think that these images reflect young adults today. It's simply what sells to these young adults. It's also not the case that young adults accept these images and model their behavior after them. And what's really going on here, according to the documentary, is a feedback loop. The media watches the kids to figure out how to target them through programming and through products. It packages an image and then sells it to the kids. The kids take this image, they rework it, they mirror it back to the media, and then the process cycles again and again. What's interesting to us as sociologists is how all of this reflects the subtle interplay between self and society. As both Milky and Merchants of Cool suggest, we aren't blank canvases onto which society reflects what it wants us to be. We actively take cultural messages, we evaluate their relevance to us, and we apply them to our self-concepts. Sometimes in that process we manage to actually rework cultural values and norms. But at the end of the day, we must contend with that generalized other. We must contend with society. Our very selfhood is wrapped up in it. As well, there are limits to our autonomy in the socialization process. For the most part, we act the way we think others want us to act. And we strive for the ideals that we think society embraces. Now, there are a lot of ways that we rebel against these ideals, but that rebellion typically comes at a price. That's going to be the topic of my next lecture on deviance. Thanks.